Welcome to King Pilled, everyone. The second show I'm doing today. I just finished up the Astrolabe, and now I've got good friend of the show, Emergent Perspective, here to talk about Elon Musk as a one-man Hanseatic League. What's going on, man? It's good to have you here.
Hey, it's great to be on. Really appreciate this, and I think this is a really interesting topic, and I think we'll get some good discussion out of it. I mean, we already had that in our little pre-discussion here.
Yeah. This is very interesting take that you had the other night or the other day when I was on Meta Prime stream talking about the PayPal mafia, the tech elite, and building a civilization, assuming we don't have one. And you hopped on there and you brought up this idea of Elon as a one man Hanseatic League, and that was like a ooh moment for me because when I first was digging into the whole PayPal mafia subject several months ago, I was talking to Charles Haywood privately, and he brought up the Hanseatic League, and that was basically the first time I'd ever heard of it. So I did a little digging into it and found it very interesting, and then kind of got distracted by other stuff. And then you brought it up again, and I was like, okay, well now this happened twice, so now I need to get to know this subject a little bit better. Do the listeners a favor and introduce yourself. I encountered you on Twitter. You've managed to build up quite the following there, and you've even caught the great Lord Elon's eye a few times. I've seen. So
Yeah.
how did Emergent Perspective become a thing?
Okay, so yeah, it's kind of funny because I've actually had quite a few replies from Elon, and it's kind of funny because he actually replied to one that was on my timeline that I didn't even like. It wasn't even a reply to his. Like he must have actually gone there. So I have a few friends that joke. They're like, Elon must stalk your profile he must be stealing ideas. So
Yeah, hopefully.
but I'll tell you, it's funny how much it blows up your timeline when that happens. But yeah, so here's kind of my take. So emergent perspective is a reference to, I believe that, I think in the realm of human endeavors, people, let's make an analogy to like people step outside their backyard and look at the weather, right? They go, okay, I'm stepping outside and it's a sunny day in my backyard, right? And people think, oh, well, it's a sunny day in my backyard. It must be like that everywhere. But someone over on the West Coast, there's a tidal wave hitting the Golden Gate Bridge, and they're going, whoa, this is a crisis, right? Someone on the East Coast or in Florida is getting hit by a hurricane, and so people have totally different perspectives. But a lot of people overestimate how much their personal, individual backyard perspective applies to the wider world. And I think in studying and evaluating different perspectives of different people at different scales, at different times and places, there are incredibly valuable insights and trends that you can spot only between perspectives, not within a single one of them. So that's kind of my approach to life, the world, philosophy, putting together a lot of ideas and concepts and looking at it from many different angles to glean insights.
So sort of like creating a meta perspective, like the perspective of all the perspectives.
Yeah, kind of both. And it's a little bit aligned with what Homath has a thing called levels, right? And he climbs up the different levels of how wide and how widely you can think and see issues. And it's very similar to his approach, even though he and I never met before seeing that. But here's a little of my personal history. So I'm a longstanding kind of semi contrarian, dissident, libertarian. I was involved back in the day in Ron Paul's 2008, 2012 campaigns. I was very early into crypto and decentralization. I've grown up and traveled in many different countries. I grew up in Japan, South Korea, England, Germany. So I have a little bit more of it, and that was something that, for me growing up, just learning how differently people in different countries and parts of the world really view things, right? They really do view reality in a different way, right? So I was very early crypto to decentralization. I did some early work there, writing under a different name. I had a couple of posts go viral on Reddit. This is back before it was woke, right?
Yeah.
But I actually got the opportunity to meet a lot of very OG crypto founders back in the day. So I've been kind of a semi lurker in that space, and I pop in and contribute, and I keep in touch with a lot of folks in that space. So I think there's a lot of commonality there. And so much of this, I think, has kind of grown out of similar thought alignment in both dissident politics and founders and innovators who are think outside the box, right? So I think we're kind of, in some sense, we're witnessing kind of the birth of a new generation of that, if you will.
Yeah, elaborate on that a little bit. Obviously being tapped into sort of the crypto world, you end up getting significant overlap with the, I don't know, tech, entrepreneur, small business ecosystem. I've been tapped into that world quite a bit, and then they get a lot of overlap into Silicon Valley. So you sort of have a bunch of different adjacent interests that all seem to be forming a similar response to a particular set of incentives. Is that what you've been noticing?
Oh, sure. And you end up really curiously, really loved about crypto, and just put crypto itself, the technology aside for a second. It's the number of disparate points of view that it brings together. I've met, lawyers, I've met engineers, I've met entrepreneurs, innovators, politicians, and I've never quite seen the melting pot of ideas and thinkers in come together in that space quite like you do around that. And of course there's the scammers and whatnot that do that stuff, and that's negatively impacted the reputation, but there is still that core of thinkers, right?
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that it brings together so many disparate points of view that way?
Well, I think there's kind of a very old answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with the origin story of Freemasonry?
Somewhat, yeah. Explain.
So, the Freemasonry came about because in the medieval days, you had, most labor was simple, right? You were the town blacksmith, you were the town tailor, you either born of noble birth and you had leadership as your role, or you were like a blacksmith, you were a tailor, you were, something relatively unskilled, right? And what happened in the Middle Ages, and this was all across Europe disparately, was eventually what came into play was something called stonemasonry, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is, okay, you have to be able to build castles, to build bridges, to build structures. You have to be able to build stone arches, right? And to build a stone arch, you need to understand math. You need to understand geometry. You need to understand precise construction techniques. You need to be able to draft and build. There's a skill set there that cannot be easily transferred. You couldn't grab a peasant off the street and teach them that in 5 minutes, right? In many cases, it required a lifetime of study. So what happened is, if you were the town blacksmith, you were a vassal of your lord, right? You had to do whatever the lord said. But stonemasonry was one of the first professions that required enough of a skill set that their skills were in demand to where there were not enough stonemasons to go around. The labor was in too short of a supply. And so what happened is, and of course at the time you were living kind of in the dark ages, and you had the Catholic Church was monopolizing the word of God through, could only be taught in Latin, right? And so it came about at the same time as the Protestant Reformation, where at the time the Catholic Church would call geometry and math and some of these things, they called them occult practices, right? So to learn the art of stonemasonry and to learn math, we think right. Doesn't this sound familiar to our current moment in history, where we have an establishment that is calling math and geometry?
Yeah.
They're calling math and geometry occult practices that must be banned. 2 + 2 = 5, right? So what happened is stonemasons became Freemasons because they had to form an underground guild. They had to pick a basement, a tavern, somewhere secret to meet, to learn their craft, to apply their craft, to do all of this, because they could be arrested for doing it in public, right? Or for teaching it to others. So because they coalesced around these guild halls and their skills were in demand, eventually the lords of the realm, because they needed their castles, their bridges, their walls built, they sided with the Freemasons and said, you know what, we're going to protect you from the church because we need our stuff built, right? And so the term Freemason comes from they were the first profession to be granted freedom because they had economic opportunity and skill that was irreplaceable, right?
That's very interesting, because also if you're there's all the different industries or different domains that it touches on. One that you didn't mention that I thought of was also logistics, like being able to to be a successful stonemason and to build these massive projects required some measure of like polymathy. You had to be an expert in a bunch of different domains, which I see you're comparing crypto to this now, because the people that are really into crypto wind up by default having to become basically experts in finance, cryptography, global markets, trade. You end up it employs a whole bunch of different things that you have to be a specialist in. You have to like be generally specialized in a bunch of different things to successfully navigate the crypto world.
Sure. But also that there's some overlap with that with tech, right? So so masonry became a secret society, a sort of underground railroad of forbidden ideas, in order to ensure the survival of the knowledge that they had accumulated and the value derived from it, right? To protect the members, to protect the knowledge, to protect the craft. And of course, they weren't the church's only target. So in 1450, Gutenberg invents the printing press, right? And all of a sudden, you have the Protestant Reformation going on. People can now print the Bible in their own language and read it for themselves. And so the Catholic Church declares the printing press to be an instrument of the devil, right? And they wanted to confiscate it. Oh, that's too dangerous. That's a challenge to our authority. And so the printing press, then you have all these printers that go, oh, well, shit, I've got this printing press and they're going to come confiscate it. I need to hide this somewhere. And they would go, oh, the local Freemason guild hall. So that's where all the books that brought about the Protestant Reformation were printed, in the Freemason guild hall, right? So these became instrumental in bringing out the Protestant Reformation, because it became this underground railroad of forbidden books and circulating them. And Niall Ferguson did a great talk on this too. But it, and so let's cap off the Freemason with kind of this last thing. So lodges became places for the like-minded to socialize, collaborate, seek training in their craft. An impressive array of knowledge was kept, and they were safeguarding it. By the end of the Middle Ages, societies had become to known lodge members as Freemasons. This is because the demand for their skills allowed them by royal decree to travel where their services were needed. Other professions were still considered vassals, and were not free to come and go as they pleased. But you were a Freemason because you're valuable enough to be free. So but that set in motion a transformation from called operative masonry, the physical craft, to something called speculative masonry, which is kind of the philosophy that grew out of it. So at one point they founded an organization called the United Grand Lodge of England in 1717, which still exists to this day. And it's often kind of the turning point between the two. So the Freemason lodges didn't just become a place to practice the craft, but it became a melting pot for ideas. So this culminating notion emerged that the same architectural principles you use to build a road, a bridge, a wall, a castle could also be used to, and this is a very important quote, build grand ideas in the hearts of men, right? And so the idea was, we will build physical things and we will build grand ideas in the hearts of men that will last throughout the ages. So as the British Empire spread, and really all the European empires, many forts and outposts of the military would include their own local lodge, and membership became an expected tradition among members of, for example, the British and French military. It served a similar social role to that of a gentleman's club, place to meet off duty, discuss politics, philosophy, intellectual. But members of the lodge met and voted as equals, regardless of their rank or nobility in the outside world. And so you probably read some history about how the founding fathers, many of them were Freemasons or had on their own come to the same kind of ideas. Thomas Jefferson wasn't, but he was basically aligned, right? He had kind of figured the same stuff out on his own. So the American Revolution was in a lot of ways the culmination of these ideas over hundreds of years coalescing into, we'll have, a constitution based on these old principles, right? And the two greatest writers that founded the American Revolution, John Locke and Thomas Paine, are very well versed. Their writing is very well versed in these concepts, and it's in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But last thing I'll say here is, in fact, the Boston Tea Party was actually launched from the Green Dragon Tavern, which was the St. Andrew's Lodge. It was launched from a Freemason lodge. So last thing I'll say here is, now there are some modern things where any institution can become corrupted over time. Now, I think the modern Freemason organization, I think it's kind of become, I think if you talk to your local, brother down at the lodge, they're very much ingrained with these principles. But there is a lot of indirect evidence that, like, the senior leadership of it is kind of, it's a corrupt elite, just like a lot of things in our society, right?
Right.
Which is very interesting how founding principles can manifest and then be hijacked by a corrupting force, right?
Right.
So, all right.
It's interesting. You real quick here. You reminded me of something that I wrote just a couple weeks ago about secret societies. The article, you can go to Real King Pilled on Twitter or on X, and you can go to the articles tab, and it's the only one I've posted so far. Here's why the Trump-Elon coalition and its war for free speech is good for you. One of the things I said in here was, all men are governed ultimately by secret societies. Networks of men with aligned interests and values form coalitions with other networks of men with their own aligned interests and values, make plans in secret, and execute them together. What we call governments and public companies are the surface layer of these agglomerated nested networks. We don't usually use the term secret societies. Instead, we use the anodyne managerialist market research term interest groups. Of course, these interest groups are rotely discussed in broad demographic terms, but those broad demographics, the largest semi-coherent networks of all, serve as semi-arbitrary proxies for deeper-lying, tighter-knit, better capitalized networks. The broad demographics are the second layer, the not-so-secret societies. Follow this trend deeper below the surface, and you'll quickly realize you're uncovering and burrowing into an upside-down triangle. There's deep esoteric significance to this, but that's another essay. And then I said, remember that governments are formed by cooperation between networks of men. Each member of each network at each layer of resolution commits his capital to that network and cedes some amount of his sovereignty with it, with the tacit agreement that the relationship will remain mutually beneficial. So as you're describing this, it reminded me of that, because you have this natural incentive for the Freemasons to form this secret society. And it's not the only secret society. There isn't one secret society that governs all of them. There's a whole bunch of different secret societies. Some of them we just call public companies or governments or bureaucracies. But each of these functions as a sort of secret society, like a discrete network of people with aligned incentives. And certain of these networks are going to have a natural selection effect that's going to lead to them pushing the envelope or be innovating more than the others. So you can see it with like the Freemasonry thing. You can see it with banking. And now it seems that tech, and maybe I'm getting ahead of the story here a little bit, but it seems that tech, broadly speaking, the way we think of the tech industry now, it has these particular characteristics that lend it toward becoming one of the most influential secret societies, if we want to speak to it that way.
Sure, and if you study a lot of history on a long enough time scale, you will find that there are often rises and falls of these things. And actually, I think a really good concept, what I was saying earlier, is one of my favorite books that's very underrated. People talk about the fourth turning, weak men, great hard times. That one's very discussed, but I think a very under-discussed one is a book called The Law of Civilization and Decay by Brooks Adams. Brooks Adams is the grandson of founding father John Adams. And he wrote, there's a couple of things he wrote. I think one of the most important ones is he wrote that every society is founded on instruments. An instrument is something that is built and it serves a purpose. It gathers energy. It builds positive things. And then he says every instrument decays into an institution, right? once it's there, it takes more skill for a founder to build something than it takes for a managerial bureaucrat to just maintain it, right? Maintain it and collect the rents. So he says every instrument becomes an institution, and over time, you find this in all institutions and all of these networks that rise and fall over the ages, right? And another key example, he says, so governments over the long period of history, they derive their power and their influence over four monopolies, and he called them knowledge, force, land, and currency. And the third one, land, we could just generalize that to property, because originally it really was just land, but now property comes in intellectual property, there's virtual property, right? There's many other forms of it. And people tend to only think of the second one, force, as being where governments get their power from, right? But in reality, modern governments do not like to use force. It's the least efficient of them. They would much rather, we talk about fifth generation warfare, they would much rather use the first monopoly, knowledge. They would much rather just propagandize you into doing what they want and giving up your money and your resources and all of those things. That's much easier, much preferable to using force. Force really is the last resort. So what I think is applicable about this is that institutions can rise and fall in power and gain and lose influence on the basis of those four monopolies, not only the second one, force, because people over discuss that in historical and political discussions, right? And the Freemasons really proved that in the 1600s. How did they overturn so many of the existing power structures? Just spreading knowledge, right?
Yeah, because if you have a monopoly on knowledge, then you don't need force. If you have a monopoly on it, that means other people don't, which means you have the edge that you can use, that you can act to preclude the necessity of needing to use force. If you have a monopoly over property, then it kind of precludes needing force because nobody else has the property. The property is enforced by the force, but you don't need to employ the force if you already have the monopoly over the property. And then a currency is an obvious one. So force is like the Schmittian exception. Like that's the one that seems to stand out from the other three.
Yes. In fact, you could say modern governments and elites really want to shy away from using force unless it's like their last resort. If they think their survival is threatened, which is, you look at what's going on with Ukraine and Putin and all of that escalation, you can point to that and say, you could point to that as evidence that they really must feel like they are under a critical enough threat to take those kinds of risks. Right?
Yeah, and they've actively undermined their monopoly on knowledge through their censorship, their pursuits of censorship. Because if you're censoring other people, you're depriving yourself of the knowledge of the things they're no longer saying because you're censoring them.
Sure. And what I would tack onto that is of course there's the narrative control, right? Because part of knowledge is the narrative. It's not just the facts. It's, you can look at one set of facts and say, this is all these here's these economic indicators. Well, those are clear evidence that Trump is going to be better. The same person could go, no. Those are all indicators that Kamala is going to do better.
Right.
Right. So it's not just the knowledge, but the narrative. And I think what you could say from that is, I think the 20th century was an era of very centralized control of that first monopoly, the knowledge and the narrative. But what happened is the internet and mobile devices came about, and all of a sudden, almost overnight, from a civilizational standpoint, they not only have anybody, it's just like the printing press. Now anybody can write and speak and say what they want. Not only is there more availability of knowledge to spread, But when you cancel it, you in the 60s or 70s, if you canceled somebody, you just took them off the air and they never got to say anything, and they would, go live in, some shack in the woods, and they'd be excommunicated. But now when you cancel somebody, there's the Streisand effect.
Mm-hmm.
You get everybody, you cancel them, but then everybody goes, whoa, what was that guy saying? It must be something juicy that nobody wanted, that they didn't want anybody to hear, right? So, yeah, I think that's anyway. I think that's a very important foundational concept. But why don't we move on to the actual league itself?
Yeah.
Because I think it shares a lot in common. And by the way, it might make sense for the audience to maybe pull up an image of the map of the league, just so they can see how many countries this actually spanned.
Okay,
it's really fascinating.
Well, I'm pulling that up. I'll say the thought that sparked for me was we've talked on the show here quite a bit about the takeover of X, the takeover of Twitter and converting it to X, and that really was we've described it as a military move. This was like a strategic military move because it hits directly at this narrative thing you're talking about, like the converting the blue check from like it used to be on Twitter, you had the meme of the blue checks was basically referring to the regime journalists, the mouthpieces, the apparatchiks of the regime.
Oh, absolutely.
Now blue check symbolizes either neutrality to the regime or hostility to it, because it's someone who's willing to give money to Elon. So taking over Twitter, turning it into X was both a destruction of one of the regime's key narrative control mechanisms, and it like cut both directions on the knowledge spectrum, because it also means now all of that data is the knowledge of that data and the ability to control it and disseminate it has that power has shifted away from the regime and into other hands. Okay, here's a picture.
Absolutely.
Is this a good picture here?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Okay.
So it actually was a network that started as a few trade towns and a few trade guilds, but it eventually I think it had almost a 400-year lifespan. And it eventually encompassed, you can see it reached all the way to London, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, parts of Poland, all the way to Russia, all the way to Sweden and Finland. And you can see that this was just a loose coalition, kind of this Freemason, like, hey, we all have this common interest in preserving our economic power here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about this kind of, and I think this is interesting because it's you could think of the approach that they're taking here, right? It's kind of like, and here's what's fascinating about the league. So throughout most of its lifespan, it lacked a permanent treasury. There was no central cash or bank that you could come confiscate. There was no permanent administrative body. It had no standing army. Right? So there's no permanent treasury. There's no, all the assets are distributed. There's no admin body. There isn't like an office. There isn't a CEO that you could come and arrest or charge with anything. It had no standing army. So again, we're looking at of those monopolies, they really didn't need force throughout. There's a few instances where they actually did, and it was more like they associated with the towns to use force in resolving some matter. But most of it is that it's the third monopoly, property, and it's the first monopoly, knowledge, right? We know the trade routes, we have the skill, and we've got the property here. So these were fishing villages, tradesmen who built on boats, so carpenters, probably metal workers, dock workers, ship captains, the companies that financed them, the companies that insured them. And the idea was they wanted to protect themselves by having this distributed network. They protected themselves from, say, the King of Denmark deciding that I'm gonna take over this and confiscate all your assets, right? Because if the network is distributed, they could always they could deny service to one particular port or client or customer, or simply say, okay, well, Your Majesty, King of Denmark, if you're going to try and shut down our trade routes, or if you're not going to buy our goods, then we can just close down these ports and you can spend the winter not having any supplies, right? And eventually, you see these scenes out of like Game of Thrones where the peasants are rising up in King's Landing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so eventually the nobles in that country would be like, look, Your Majesty, we need to not be shutting down the trade ports and right. The material blockade and the lack of expertise would cause even the nobles in those countries to put pressure on the king. And of course, many of them were eventually members, right? Because if they saw this decentralized league win, then they'd go, well, why don't I join that? Why don't I join my business with that? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make
How
sense?
formal was the organization? Was there any formality to it at all, or was it purely just you could identify, and the way that you identified was by cooperating together, and if you chose not to cooperate, then you were no longer part of it, just kind of an informal agreement?
So they did have the central city was Lubeck, and they would once every few years they would convene a council of the current members, right?
Okay.
It was on an as needed basis, right? It wasn't on a daily basis, and nobody needed anybody's permission really, although they could get together and vote if somebody was really acting against the interests of everybody else. Then they could get together and vote that person out, or simply disown them, right? If you're violating the common interest, then you're ejected, right? You didn't need a formal process for doing this. But they would convene every few years a council to vote on certain rules and certain policies, but it was really on an as needed basis, and there was no central leader or central figure to sort of snatch up, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this gets me. Here's a kind of a short. Let's make this a short side topic, but I think decentralization is key. Not having a single place where everybody can be rounded up and forced into compliance, right? And it reminded me of Rod Beckstrom, who was a former Department of Homeland Security cybersecurity guy who became very big into decentralization and crypto. I actually got to meet him at a conference a few years ago. He wrote a book called The Starfish and the Spider, contrasting centralized organizations like corporations with decentralized organizations like Hanseatic League being a key example. But one of the most interesting examples he had in that book that I thought was fascinating was he talked about the Comanches and the Apaches, right? Because when the U.S. Government spread west and took over most of the lands from the Indian tribes, most of them offered little resistance because they didn't have the tech, they didn't have the organization, although there were a few points in history like Tecumseh, who was an exception of that during the War of 1812. But for the most part, their approach was, oh, we've got this tribe, let's go capture the leadership, let's force them to sign a treaty, and then we'll resettle the tribe onto this land and disarm them and then tax them and all this stuff, right? But the two tribes that gave them the most trouble were the Comanches and the Apaches. And the Apaches were almost impossible because they had a very decentralized leadership structure, right? And it comes back to the concept of, we think of leadership as, okay, we appoint a CEO, we have a hierarchy, he appoints corporate officers, we appoint middle management. In the Apache culture, there was no such concept as the concept of a permanent leader, right? To them, leadership was a combination of two very simple factors. The first one is, who do I trust, right? So they would, if they needed to solve a problem as a tribe or do something, they would say, okay, well, who do I trust? Who's got 10 years of experience? Who do we know the best that can do this? If they're organizing a hunting expedition, they'd say, well, who's got the most experience, right? And it was a combination of that, and then whose expertise or experience is most applicable to the task at hand. right? There was no such thing as we've got a commanding officer who's in charge no matter what the problem is. So if the Apaches arranged a hunting expedition, they would say, let's gather these 15 hunters together. These 3 or 4 guys have the most experience, so they will take lead. But then they would say, oh, well, we're going to go through the mountains. What man knows these mountains the best? And they'd say, oh, they would have the man who knows the mountains the best would lead the tribe through the mountains. The man who knows the valley the best would lead the tribe through the valley. The man who knew the river the best would lead the tribe back along the river, right? So leadership to them was not, there's a permanent guy in charge. It's who's most applicable at the current moment. And the moment the current situation changed, leadership would shift and change, right? So the U.S. cavalry, they would raid the Apaches and they would say, okay, well, we're raiding these guys. This guy appears to be the leader. We'll capture that guy and we'll drag him back to the fort and make him sign a treaty, and nothing. The Apaches would just put some other guy in charge.
It's kind of like a lizard that just drops its tail when you grab it.
Exactly, right? So they could make one guy sign a treaty, but then nobody else would obey it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when the rulers of these vast swaths of European countries, if they said, all right, that's it, we're pissed off at the Hanseatic League and their monopoly over the fishing and the boats and the construction and all this stuff, go grab the nearest dock worker and go grab the nearest dock worker who's the guy that's in charge of down at the docks, and we'll threaten him, right? And everybody else would just carry on working. Right?
What were the fundamental units of the Hanseatic League? Was it like if you're going to have a meeting of the member organizations, for lack of a better term, who were the representatives? Were the cities? Was it merchant guilds that were the individual members? What was at what level?
So in the case of the towns or cities that were members, so some cities where the whole city was, Lubeck was kind of the capital city of it, right? Where the whole city and the whole city council were kind of members of it, right? But so there were city councils, there were town councils, but then there were the local dock workers could simply have their own individual council, right? The local carpenters could have their own. So there were multiple overlapping layers of this. But also, here's the other part of it, is no part of being a member of the league precluded you from being a member of anything else, right? You could be a member of the league and be a member of one of these existing governments. You could wear 2 hats, so to speak. You're a member of the league and you're a member of whatever your public identity in the outside world was. And it got to the point where they didn't have to keep it secret. So back to the Apaches for a second, though. Now, this is a historical name you've probably heard. So at one point in the war between the Apaches and the U.S. cavalry, the Apaches eventually recognized that they were being raided and captured, and eventually they recognized the need for, we need a larger leader, right? They had never had something what we would call a general, right? But they recognized that they needed to band together in larger groups, and so leadership could be appointed, via their protocol as, let's get the guy who has led the most battles to be the leader. And you probably heard the name of this historical figure. His name is Geronimo. So, and of course, he led the Apaches on a campaign for several years. And then the U.S. cavalry, they launched a campaign to, we got to capture Geronimo. This is a real important objective. And when they finally did and set up a raid and captured this guy, all the Apaches did was name up some other guy Geronimo and carry on like nothing happened.
So Geronimo doesn't refer to a single person.
Yes, it does. Yes. Like there is the historical figure because he was captured, and that was how they learned the Apache language and the culture and the concepts, right? Was by listening to this guy. And he had he actually wrote a diary about his experience and some of his cultural things he learned about Western civilization. And this is kind of funny because the soldiers at the fort, they would talk to him, and he would learn their language, and they would learn his. And eventually they got linguists out there, and he would ask them questions like, he would say, so you soldiers, you came out here and fought my tribe and you captured me. And he would say, well, why did you come out here and capture me? And they would say, well, we had orders from the president. And he said, oh, okay. So he'd say, okay, well, next time you see your president, tell him I'd like to speak to him. And they go, what? We've never met the president. He had no concept that this leader of theirs was some guy half a continent away that they had never met. He would ask them questions like, so this president of yours, he's this great leader in your tribe. You must have hunted with this man. You must have fished with this man. And they'd be like, no, we've never hunted with the president. We've never fished with the president. And he would ask them this question in return. Then how do you know you can trust him? And their answer was, well, a lot of us don't trust him. In fact, some of us don't even like him. That's just our system, right? So, and then he would ask, okay, well, so this president of yours, so he sent you soldiers out here to fight, so he must be the greatest warrior in your tribe. And they were like, no. He's not the greatest warrior in the tribe. Well, then he must, he'd say, well, then he must know these deserts better than any other man. No, our president has never been out to the desert. He's not a warrior. He doesn't know any of this stuff. And so to Geronimo, this was very dumbfounding that how does this great civilization have this leader half a continent away that they don't like, they don't trust. He's not a good leader. He doesn't know anything about the task at hand. And yet these people, right? And I think in that line of inquiry, there's a real, there's a real kind of simple wisdom there.
Yeah,
right?
That's what I was thinking.
And since I read that in Rod Beckstrom's book, I've spent a lot of my life kind of asking that question. Every time I've been on a job or a contract or whatever, and ask yourself that, right? I talk to people all the time that say, I don't like my boss. I don't know my boss. I don't have any personal affinity for him. And most of the bureaucrats that run Western society don't have any expertise relevant to the task at hand, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most of them, we're a society that has over bureaucratized to the point where we have untrustworthy leadership that is not trusted, not liked, that is not having, they don't have expertise relevant to the task at hand, although some of them do, right? There is some knowledge and expertise. But I think, and I think you could say this is a product of the 19th and 20th centuries where large scale bureaucracy was the only way to organize at scale, right? And we've now entered an era where it becomes possible. Oh, I see one of the comments is imagine Geronimo in an HR department, right?
You listen to women?
He would say, this person doesn't hunt. They don't fish. Nobody likes them. Nobody trusts them. Right? But that's exactly it, right? But what I think is interesting is, I think depending on cultures around the world, I think probably most of us started out with a more Apache style of leadership, right? Where it was more decentralized. Let's follow the most sensible leader. Let's, leader, if you dump a bunch of people on an island, that's the kind of leadership that naturally emerges, right?
Right.
And of course, bureaucracy and hierarchy are things we build later because we try to organize things at scale. And I think for a long time before the internet, that we used that because it was the most efficient way. But now we have this possibility of kind of civilizationally upending that, at least a little bit, right? Now, I don't think bureaucracy and hierarchy will entirely go away because I think there are still some things that you need bureaucracy. A little bit of bureaucracy is good. In small doses, it makes sense, right? But I think you have this, what we've unwittingly done is we've kind of stumbled back into an age where we all are kind of, I mean, and by the way, the modern version of the Apache Geronimo style leadership, we call it LFG, right? Think of anyone that has played an online game, a first person shooter, an MMO. What do? You go, you organize like the Apaches, right? You go, okay, we need these 5 roles. You know, if you're running, like, we need a tank, we need a healer, we need DPS, you know, right, in a game. Or in a first person shooter, you go, okay, I need someone to lead, I need a guy to play sniper, I need a guy to play medic, right? So we actually are sitting upon an entire generation of young men that has spent a majority of their lives embracing Apache style leadership and learning the failures and drawbacks of too much hierarchy, too much bureaucracy, too much lack of trust, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting what allowed the Apaches to function in a. It's like you can have. Let me think how to put this. So you centralize because you're trying to make your actions more efficient. You're trying to unify and operate at a larger scale.
Sure.
When you decentralize, the risk is that you get more inefficient. That you separate your.
You certainly can.
Yeah. You have like a coordination issue, and you try to simplify that coordination issue through centralization. However, the more things that you try to centralize, the more diverse your group gets across a number of different variables. The more centralization actually causes inefficiency. And there's an equilibrium that we're looking for here, and it seems that the introduction of the internet and video games and social media and crypto has it's created a way to like move up a layer of resolution to where we can now we can centralize in a decentralized way in a broader fashion. Because but you still have the same problem where it's like, okay, well, how diverse do you want to be? How decentralized do you want to be, but still maintaining coherence?
Sure. Well, and you kind of have both, right? And neither approach has entirely done away with the other, and I don't think they will entirely do. But take this example. You know, one of my favorite examples from something like Reddit is, have you ever heard of a thing called RBI? It's Reddit Bureau of Investigation.
No, I haven't heard of that.
So it's like, you get these channels and sub-channels thread where people go, and there are actually groups of people that they pull up these 20, 30, 40-year-old missing person cases, cold cases, unsolved murders, unsolved, all kinds of things. And all they do is they just post, oh, what do you think about this? Is an interesting case. And all you do is you post it, and then somebody that's scanning that who goes, oh, I'm a forensic pathologist, right? Because think about how many cases went unsolved because you needed to get together and centralize, right? How many legal consultations have never occurred because you have to go to a lawyer, you have to take time out of your day, you have to pay a fee. But think about when you can post that legal question or whatever it is on a forum where 1,000 lawyers may see it and weigh in on it, right?
Yeah.
And we have things like voting systems, likes and dislikes and retweet, where we tend to have ways of not only increasing the number of eyes and decreasing the amount of bureaucracy it takes to solve the problem, but also we're creating mechanisms for the best answers and the best content to rise to the top, right?
Right.
We're trying to create better ways of collaborating. And in many ways, so in the case of RBI, there are cases where 30, 40-year-old cold cases that some of the best police departments and detectives in the country couldn't solve, right? Look at the early, the show Unsolved Mysteries. What was that? Well, it was not only, it was an entertaining show, but it was also, they would take crimes and they would say, let's increase the number of eyes on this to see if we can get somebody out there to call in and say, I know something about that. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like that approach, but on steroids. So what happened with things like this is, decentralization and the Apache approach to trying to solve problems in many cases yields answers that are vastly superior to what a bureaucracy can produce, right?
Mm-hmm.
But of course, what naturally happens with this is, of course, some people find this cool. I think there's cases that people really like, but then you have the possibility that we get into these discussions about, oh, well, the experts disagree, right? Because now you have some of these bureaucrats, and many of them tend to be insecure. They feel like their job is threatened by a bunch of kids on an internet forum solving a problem that they couldn't. Right?
Like the Shia LaBeouf on 4chan. The Shia LaBeouf was posting his "He Will Not Divide Us."
Oh,
thing.
The capture the flag.
And the capture the flag. Yeah.
And so he took what he thought was I dare you to find this thing, right?
Right.
And he really thought that he had outsmarted the entire internet, right?
Little did he know.
He really thought he had outsmarted the whole internet by hiding a flag somewhere. And all of these autists got together and they found it and they took it. And his ego really took a bruising from that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of the conflict we see in society now is kind of this you see these bureaucrats, you see these big corporations who get very angry in some cases that they've been shown up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there is misinformation and disinformation that does exist, but I think a lot of times they use that as a way of saying, oh, well, it's just like the Catholic Church. Math and geometry is an occult practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So we have reached a point where we kind of have this assembling of the decentralized knowledge base. I think we have put together some things that have the potential to challenge some of these traditional structures, and I think we are really starting to see the conflict and the pushback, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think in the case of Elon is, his companies are both centralized and decentralized. Obviously, it is many cases it's a traditional brick and mortar, but many cases his companies are distributed across different countries. He's also got different political and economic interests aligned there, but he also has a portfolio similar to the Hanseatic League, right? Because if the Hanseatic League was just one fishing boat, right? Well, the kingdoms of Europe can do without that one fishing boat. They're not going to go bankrupt. But if the league has all the fishing boat captains, or maybe not even all, let's say 70% of the fishing boat captains find it within their interest to join the league, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that then there's a bit of power in that you can say, well, if one of these countries or kingdoms wants to play ball, if Denmark wants to play ball and Norway doesn't, then you can shift some of that. Well, we'll shift some of our economic activity to your competitor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the power comes from, now there's your base layer. You go from one fishing boat to 60 or 70% of the fishing boats, but then you go, oh, the dock workers look at that and they go, well, why wouldn't we get in on that, right? If the fishing boats and the fishing boat captains can get in on that, then why can't the dock workers get in on that? And then the craftsmen who work on the boats and the docks go, hey, that's a good arrangement. Let's get in on that, right?
Right.
And then you have the supply and logistics companies that have heard about, they go, well, why wouldn't we get in on that, right? So there is this aligned incentive that can come together, right?
Might be emergent, you might say.
It There you go. And what's interesting is we've reached a point where, some of these things I explain to people, like LFG, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's both valuable to go through the story of the Apaches, but it's also valuable to simply say LFG, and people realize, holy crap, I've been doing that my whole life. I just never thought of it as that, right? So I think there's really nothing new under the sun. Freemasonry and that concept is nothing new. The Hanseatic League is nothing new. Trade and craft guilds challenging economic power is nothing new. Freedom of speech and overturning old ideas is nothing new. We've simply come together with a lot of these things in a new form at a very interesting historical moment.
Do you think it would be accurate to say that the Hanseatic League was like perhaps the initial foray into the development of a quote unquote European identity versus, I mean, it's still very early on. And even now, I think that trying to identify what European even means,
Sure.
creating a single identity that encompasses all the different demographics in Europe is pretty difficult. Not in the same way that like there is a clear American identity that supersedes all the different local state level identities in a way that is distinct from Europe. That there isn't as coherent of a European identity that accumulates all the different countries in Europe as there is with an American identity. But do you think that the Hanseatic League was because it's kind of got this is before the rise of the nation state per se, but it's kind of got a bit of a transnational dynamic to it.
Oh yeah, and I think it absolutely could have played a role in some of that and in some cross-cultural exchange, right? But also, I think culture develops in many different layers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, people have your local traditions, but then you have regional traditions. And my time growing up and traveling to Japan is a fascinating case study in this, right? Japan has so many layers of local tradition, regional tradition, national tradition. And the Japanese have this fascinating practice of, last time I went to Japan, I went to both I went to the tomb of the Tokugawa shogun who unified the country at the end of their medieval period in the 1600s. His name was Lord Tokugawa Ieyasu. So I went to that shrine, and I also visited the shrine of Emperor Meiji, who was the one who conducted the Meiji Restoration in I believe it was the 1860s, the mid 19th century. And he kind of reformed Japan into this modern nation, right? So these were two men who kind of bookended. One man conquered their country and unified it at the end of their medieval period, and the other man reformed it into a modern nation in result to a lot of these outside forces, right? And so, but what happened at each of these periods is, the other one I visited was actually, I believe it's 1,500-year-old Shinto shrine on the island of Enoshima, right? So the Japanese have things that have been around for 1,500 years that people have kept up, these very old traditions. And what they do is every time their country enters a new era or a new period, they don't tear down the statues. They don't cancel culture themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
They take the old things and they preserve them, and then they layer new things on top of it, right? They put the old things kind of away in a very carefully curated place, and then they enter the new era. In downtown Tokyo, I was walking, and you can literally walk right past a brand new Samsung smartphone store that has the newest Samsung smartphones in it, maybe even some stuff you can't even get here yet, right? And right next to it is an 800-year-old Shinto shrine with some sacred artifacts that were once part of the landlord's house, whose noble house was in that area, right? And you're like, this thing is right next to that thing, right?
Right. Ancient technology alongside modern technology.
Right. Westerners, we have this sort of weird thing that we do, that the new thing arrives and we feel like we have to tear down the old thing immediately, and that our process of doing the new thing isn't complete until we've torn down the old thing, right? We've got to tear down the old. But what they do is they have so many layers of overlapping culture. So back to this. I think what you probably have here in the Hanseatic League is you have a overlapping, you probably formed an overlapping, you know how they talk about the culture of sailors, right? Sailors the world over, in any clime and place, have a certain culture, right? Talk to anybody that's ever been in any country's navy, and they all kind of speak the same language, right? They talk about the sea like it's a personified entity. The sea is a harsh mistress, right? There's certain superstitions and traditions and things that maritime culture does, right? So what this probably did is it probably created some of that maritime culture between these countries, some cultural exchange, some language exchange, some food exchange, right? A lot of these things that globalists claim they want, and there's the good of globalism, right? But if you decentralize it and allow it to happen more organically, then it tends to be more constructive than destructive. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I think what you probably saw here is a formation of a new layer of European culture and coalescing with an older layer of culture. I wrote something a while back that kind of talks about this. Let's see if I can pull this up real quick. So there's a concept of how human memory is kind of stored symbolically, right? And so the world is a 3D globe, but we compress it onto a map, right? The map is not the territory; it's simply a representation, right? And so this is when I was talking, when it came up in that, I think we may have talked about it in that meta space, or at least I talked about it in one of his spaces, I grew up I had a childhood home. One place is up in Canada where some of my ancestors lived. And I remember walking into that place as a child, and it was, there's always this distinct smell of that wood, right? And I remember so many of my childhood memories, playing and visiting with friends and relatives, and summers and barbecues. They were all kind of mixed in with that smell, right? And I remember one day I visited there, and I hadn't been there in 10 or 15 years. And I walked in, and that smell, and it's pine wood, right? The smell of pine wood is a very distinct scent. And as I smelled that for the first time in 15 years, I got this flood of memories coming back to me, right? And there was a scientist, Max Wertheimer, who did a study, and it showed that memory is symbolic, and there's a relationship between how music is played and how it's remembered, right? So musician can take a melody, transpose it into another key, play it two octaves higher on a different instrument, and yet the listener hears the same melody. Two songs are played in the physical world, but only one is remembered in ours. The symbolic nature of memory ties the new song back to the original. So modern studies with brain scans have confirmed this even more precisely. Both melodies are perceived the same way, and they both trigger the recall of associations. So when we say a song takes us back to high school, it actually does, because your memories of high school are intertwined with your memories of that song, right? Your childhood memories of that cabin or that house are tied and triggered by that smell, right? So I think that when you have all this culture and language exchange in many different places, you're kind of creating a collective song, right? So you look at things like parts of European culture, parts of maritime culture, parts of what the Freemasons did, right? These things are like songs that people eventually recall and tune back into, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's funny that here we are sitting on the internet hundreds of years after this group of people died, and we're kind of playing the same song.
Yeah, it's like a song that's, I mean, the overlaps between music and geometry and all the way down to the atomic structure of reality and all the way up to the cosmic level. There's so many overlaps with all of that there's a very clear there's a very clear order, like a common language to the universe.
Absolutely. And here's this part that I wrote that I think it kind of drives this point home. It said, imagine 1,000 years ago, someone wrote and played a song. This song connected deeply enough to sweep its way into the lives of millions, mixing its emotions with those of its audience. Each time it was replayed, these memories mixed new listeners with old. Could a song and its inspirations become intertwined and inseparable, each carrying the other across generations? If you heard it today, could some of that connect with you? It's like all of these things that happen in both individual and collective consciousness, they're like songs that get replayed and rediscovered, right?
Right.
So
Elon, Elon is kind of, so Elon being the one-man Hanseatic League Elon is like, through the different companies that he's set up and the fact that each of these companies implicates a whole bunch of different industries, finance, sure, battery technology, space.
Sure.
There's a whole wide range of things that each of these companies implicates. And the more successful he is, the more integral each of his companies becomes, the more he becomes like a shelling point for everyone else, where there's sure, an increasing natural incentive for people to want a piece of the action, to recognize where he's going, and he's beginning to embody this same spirit that, like, he himself is embodying the spirit that once embodied the Hanseatic League at large. Sure. We've moved up a level of abstraction here, where that spirit can now be consolidated into a single person who's like a representation of that allows for coordination at a different level of scale that we didn't previously have available to us.
Sure. And you could say, you could also simplify that to Elon a lot of us have been playing the same song separately and individually, but Elon kind of very rapidly tuned a lot of us into the melody, right? And shifted the direction of it.
That's very poetic.
And I think Trump has done that too. I think Elon has done that in one sense, more from a tech angle. And I think Trump has done that from the angle of American culture, right? Let me go to my post real quick on so that Palmer Luckey post about great man derangement syndrome, right? Where the left will only accept great men if they're on their side, right? So yeah. I wrote a quick post on this on the great man derangement syndrome. So here's an example. So war on great men has taken center stage. These days, a large portion of America seems not only infected with a desire to dismantle everything about its culture, but dedicated to preventing its future from looking anything like its past. The truth about this lies beneath the surface. I encountered the essence of the problem in a discussion I had last year. I went to a trip in Japan. On that trip, I had a conversation with, I don't know if you've ever heard the song Chocolate Rain.
Yeah.
I was actually there with the guy, Tay Zonde, the guy who made that song. Right?
Oh, nice. Okay.
So he and I struck up a conversation. Now, I grew up in Japan, and I've been there many times, and I love it. But it was his first time in the country. So I found it very interesting that he had newcomers like, this is my first time seeing this place, and I'm very initiated into it. So he was visiting with a fresh perspective. So he said to me, we had some poignant observations, and he said, he said, for me visiting, and mind you, he's also a bit left-leaning, right?
Okay.
He said, for me, visiting Japan was a nice window into a society that has a very different social contract than the United States. He said, the biggest difference is that they have a rigorous, shame-enforced understanding that no individual's interests can too forcefully veto the whole. And that is true. In Japan, it is socially taboo. They do pride excellence, but it's like excellence without arrogance, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like excellence through humility about it, right? But also excellence tempered by tradition. Whereas in the United States, freedom is lionized as, he says, in the United States, freedom is lionized as individual interest, forcefully vetoing the whole, and celebrated as merit, ingenuity, liberty, with endless metaphors like two wolves and a lamb deciding what's for dinner. And that's his quote, not mine. He says, the American hero is the irritating contrarian who is accommodated by being contrary to civil society, because that's where mavericks, geniuses, Ayn Rand protagonists come from. He says, in Japan, their idea of a hero is someone who makes the elders proud, makes society pleasant, and is modest, honorable, and self-sacrificing to uphold these. And I said to him, you know, for someone that just came to this country for the first time, there's some very sharp observations there, right? Japanese society has many cultural layers that exist. They take great care to preserve social customs, rituals, places, and obligations. Many Japanese, so example, that island I went to, where there are shrines that have been there for 1,500 years. And it's many of the same families that own the houses and the shops and the restaurants. So in a Japanese family, the most successful eldest child or son might go off to Tokyo, go to a fancy university, and get a high-flying job at some big corporation, right? The middle child might move to the next town over and raise a family and live a more humble lifestyle. And the kind of the underperformer in the family, or whatever you want to call it, will kind of take a vow of poverty to live on that island, preserve the local shrines and culture, and not live an extravagant lifestyle. But they see it as valuable to sort of take this vow of poverty in service of preserving something that should be preserved. In this case, the culture, the shrines, that family home, right? That's how that's been there for 1,500 years. So I said to him, I think Americans could learn some great lessons from that. If we want to neutralize cancel culture and rebuild America's sense of civic virtue, we need to develop something like that, or some sense of that. I said, but as someone who grew up in both countries, it's a very apt observation on a long time scale. But what I would add is that the rugged individualist American you're talking about, that ideal, the Ayn Rand protagonist, right? Throughout most of U.S. history was tempered by some very strong family and cultural boundaries. You know, libs refer to a lot of this as oppressive patriarchy, but a lot of it kept that individualist energy focused on things like being an entrepreneur, being a cowboy with a ranch, being a soldier, being an athlete, being a scientist who overturns the status quo, etc. It kept those things channeled in a positive direction. But what happened is now we've lost all the rugged part of the rugged individualist American, and we've replaced it with, whiny, woke individualist American. So we've redirected that spirit of individualism towards, I'm going to change my hair color and my gender pronouns, and I'm going to compete with other people to hate all of the prior culture and aspirations associated with it.
It's been directed toward deconstruction instead of construction.
Exactly. And Elon Musk is one of the most reviled men in America to those that think this way. He's not celebrated at all. Right? And that's exactly, and it's the same thing. The people that love Trump love him for those reasons, because he represents a return to rugged individualist American, right?
Mm-hmm.
He represents a revival of that. But the left and the wokes want him destroyed because they see it as, well, if we can, they must destroy him to affirm, their beliefs, right?
Hmm.
And I think, I said overall, I think regardless of your opinion, cultures exist in layers. You can't alter one layer without altering the whole. But a lot of people with too much time sitting in air-conditioned offices thought otherwise.
Yeah, I've got a kind of a vision that would be might be interesting to ponder through all the implications of it. Maybe this could be a subject for a continuation of this conversation. I'm imagining like a Punnett square where you have on one side you have constructive and deconstructive, and on the other side you have individualist and collectivist. And so then you would get the like constructive individualism and destructive individualism, and constructive collectivism and destructive collectivism. And there's like four archetypes there that might be interesting to unpack and see which ones have their place and which contexts and how they manifest in different human organizations. Because there is a place for deconstruction. It's not that deconstruction itself is bad or wrong. There's a time for deconstruction. In a sense, Elon and Trump both represent a they're constructing through deconstruction. They're deconstructing the old, not old, but the established way of doing things, like the established way of being a decent politician. Trump is completely deconstructing that. That's why people see him as like a hand grenade tossed into the china shop.
Oh, sure. And to give you another example of that, so go back to Japanese history for a second. So Tokugawa Ieyasu founded the shogunate in the 1600s that ended their medieval period, unified the country, and then his descendants ruled Japan for 15 generations unchallenged, right? And you've seen like movies like The Last Samurai, right? This was the conquest of that era. But what happened over that 250-year period was the samurai went from being the most fearsome warriors the world has ever known to they slowly became these useless, kind of decadent bureaucrats prancing around in armor and swords that they hadn't swung at anybody in 250 years, right? So you fast forward to the end of that period, the end of so what happened there was the Japanese capital was originally in Kyoto, but when Tokugawa Ieyasu founded his shogunate, he moved the capital to a city on the coast called Edo. So that became known as the Edo period. They still had the emperor in Kyoto as the symbolic authority, right? But they moved the actual government to Edo, the city along the coast that was more practical for ruling the country. That happened for 15 generations until what happened was the Meiji Restoration. So that's Emperor Meiji. And what happened there was they had become decadent and Japan was very backwards. And then a rapid series of events happened where Commodore Matthew Perry showed up and forced the Japanese shogun at the time to bend the knee and sign this incredibly unfair trade agreement that screwed over the Japanese merchant and artisan classes, right? So they forced them to sign this treaty that said foreign ships can come trade in Japanese ports and they'll charge you a 30% tariff, but you can't charge them any tariff in return, right? So he bent the knee, this man that was supposed to be strong, he bent the knee to a foreign power. He screwed over his own artisans and merchants. He wouldn't hear any of his clan lords, any of their complaints about this. And then amidst all this, these foreign gunboats like French and Dutch, they would come into these ports, and they had several incidents like the Tsushima incident where they opened fire on these Japanese ports, and their sailors would come in drunk and rape and attack, and they were told they couldn't do anything about it, right? So you're pissing off your constituents, you're not listening to their complaints, so the Japanese formed this movement called the Sonojoy, which means expel the barbarians. Sound familiar? Right?
Auslander Rouse.
We're getting sick of letting these foreigners come in and run roughshod over us physically, economically, et cetera, et cetera. So what happens is eventually the shogunate was the real government, but the emperor was the symbolic government. So all these discontented Japanese lords started convening around the emperor and saying, well, the shogun will not hear our complaints, but your majesty, will you at least hear us out, right? And so they began to realize we're not alone in our discontent. And so the emperor gave his blessing to two of these clans in Western Japan to go ahead and you may fight back against the foreigners with my blessing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and then what happens is the shogun gets, well, you're challenging my authority. And on paper, the emperor is his boss, but in actuality, he's got the real authority, right? So there was a couple of battles. Two of the clans that actually hated each other, Satsuma and Choshu, formed an alliance for mutual defense, and they started buying modern weapons from foreigners, right? And the shogun, his forces are still lances and pikes and horses, right? So they start to modernize. The shogun comes out and fights them, and he sends a small expeditionary force that basically gets crushed. And there it kind of builds into a full-on rebellion. And it culminates in a battle outside of Kyoto and Osaka Castle, where they defeated this small expeditionary force that the shogun had sent, and the emperor declared the restoration of the throne, and he declared the rebel forces his new imperial army, right? And instantly, almost overnight, 60% of the country, which was discontent and sitting on the sidelines, switches sides and joins the rebels. So they end up putting him back on the throne, but he institutes all these reforms. He says, okay, we've got to modernize. We've got to come into the modern era. We've got to culturally reform. We've got to put away some of these old things. He abolished the samurai as a class, right? We've got to put some old things away. Now, we didn't totally get rid of it because that's still revered in Japan to this day, but it got put away in museums and we're not like taking it seriously, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he also opened up economic freedom, cultural reforms. So all of these name any Japanese company you'd recognize today, Samsung, Toshiba, Sony, all of these companies which were banned, a lot of private enterprise, it was not state sanctioned, was banned under the shogunate, but the emperor just brought all those things back, right? And you had this horrendous era of new innovation, right? Because suddenly all these people that wanted to build and do great stuff, and a lot of these became intergenerational dynasties. During the Tokugawa period, the playing cards were outlawed. You were not allowed to play cards, right? You couldn't play spades. But they re-outlawed that, and a company called Nintendo made the first playing cards. I'm sure you've heard of this company, right?
Interesting.
So in the mid-1800s, playing Nintendo meant playing newly unoutlawed playing cards. So he culturally reformed. If you go to the shrine in Japan, you'll see that he was the first. He adopted the Western business suit. He said, we're not putting away all our Japanese culture, but we're going to modernize. We will wear business suits. We will eat with knives and forks. We will eat Western food. We will drink Western whiskey. We will build tall buildings, right? This is, he kind of culturally guided them from one era and putting away the things they needed to put away as a culture and embracing the new things they needed to come into the modern era. And I feel like in some ways, we're really at a turning point that's a lot like this.
No kidding. I see a lot of parallels there. And this is probably a good point to leave off. I got to get running here because I got a couple of calls.
Okay.
But this
awesome.
is, I think we've got at least another episode talking about this because I've never heard any of this. And the parallels here are stunning. And I think it gives us a really good insight into the sorts of trends we could probably expect to see, and may even be able to play some role in formalizing ourselves over the next couple of decades.
Oh, absolutely.
Let the people know where they can find you. If you have any last thoughts to leave us off on, let the people know where they can find you, and we'll get out of here.
Okay, yeah, my X profile is @_Emergent_. You can go there, and then I have a link tree that has all my other links. I've got a few other things. I've got a Substack, which I'm actually reworking some of my older articles that I wrote about 10, 14 years ago and repurposing those. And surprisingly, all of them have kind of held up. They've stood the test of time, right? I just read you excerpts from two of them here. But yeah, follow me there. Follow me on X. I may do more. I'll probably do some more streams like this. I do spaces on a semi-regular basis. But this was a really great conversation, and I appreciate the time and the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for coming on, man. I can't wait for the next one.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to do this again.
I'll be dropping this one out to Gen Pop here next week, and so if you're listening to this after the fact, either on public YouTube stream or on any of the podcasting networks, then do me a favor and hit the like button, subscribe, leave us a 5-star rating and review on your podcatcher of choice. And then you can join the Kingpill Discord at kingpill.com. That's one of the best ways to support us. We're actually going to be doing the Schizo stream here tonight. So if you want to be a part of any future Schizo stream in there, then that's the place to go, kingpill.com. And let's see, anything else? Oh, and if you want to be, I'm going to start doing more streams like this, interviews with different fascinating thinkers like Emergent Perspective here. If you want to join in on those, then you can become a channel member on YouTube. It's only $5 a month. You can become an esteemed member of the King Pilled. And then you can actually participate in the live chat and get these early before everyone else. Well, I guess a word of the wise, to become a channel member, YouTube makes it just about as hard as possible. You can't do it from a cell phone. I guess you have to go to a PC, and then you'll have the join option there. So that's how you can become a member, and you can get these episodes before everyone else. So that's all I got for now. I will be back tomorrow. For those of you who are watching live right now, I'll be back tomorrow morning for the Astrolabe. And then keep a lookout. Go follow Emergent, and keep a lookout for our future conversations. Go subscribe to his Substack and follow him on Twitter. And we will develop some more of these ideas here in the future. So thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you guys later.
Hey.